Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Bean Family Stories channel. This is where we bring you interesting, funny and inspiring stories from Mr. Bean family every day. You will meet me, Mr. Bean's daughter, someone you may be familiar with and I hope you love, my dad with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely brother who always brings positive energy with his stories close to life. Every day, one of us will share new stories, interesting journeys, and today it's my turn. I will take you on an exciting adventure, but also with profound lessons about life. Today's story carries a simple but important message: never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprises waiting for us. If you like our family dynamic, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave some interesting comments to let me know what you think. Now, let's dive into today's story and dive into the world of surprises. Let's get started. The courtroom was unnervingly quiet, the heavy mahogany panels casting a somber shadow over everything. Emma Roberts, 34, sat straight in the defendant's chair, her hands trembling slightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breath. The cold gaze of Judge Thomas Harrington bore down on her from the elevated bench, a silent promise that justice would be swift and harsh. In the midst of all the whispers and rustling papers, Emma felt as though she were in a room full of strangers. She was no longer just the woman fighting for her community, the woman who ran the children's center that had been a lifeline for so many families. Here, in this sterile environment, she was a defendant, her name smeared by false accusations. The charges against her were grave: obstruction of justice, falsifying documents, claims that were as ridiculous as they were damaging. But the weight of the court's atmosphere, the steel gaze of the judge, and the oppressive silence of the room made her wonder if anyone would believe her. Emma had always known that the world outside her little community center was harsh, that the power brokers and developers in the city would stop at nothing to build their empire. But she never imagined she would become a target in their game. As the clerk read out the charges, Emma's mind raced back to the moment when everything had begun to unravel, the day the city had announced its plans to demolish the community center, the heart of so many families, and replace it with luxury apartments. Emma had only done what anyone in her position would: she fought back. She submitted a claim that the building was a historical landmark, an attempt to buy time, to save the place that had nurtured so many young lives. But now, the very documents she had used to protect her center were being used against her. The fight had escalated from community activism to courtroom drama, with her future hanging by a thread. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the judge's voice sliced through the silence, commanding the court's attention. Case number 247B, the state versus Emma Roberts, charges of obstruction of justice and tampering with government documents. How do you plead? Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood firm. Not guilty, Your Honor. The words felt hollow in her mouth, an echo in the vast, cold space of the courtroom. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon her. The spectators, the court officers, and most notably, the jury, whose expressions ranged from indifference to quiet suspicion, seemed to judge her long before the case had even started. District Attorney Jack Mitchell rose from his seat, adjusting his expensive suit as he began to speak. His voice, smooth and practiced, filled the room. Your Honor, the state requests that bail be denied. Ms. Roberts has shown a blatant disregard for the law, and she poses a flight risk. She has already taken extreme measures to obstruct the legal process, and we have ample evidence to prove it. Emma glanced at her appointed attorney, a young, overwhelmed lawyer named Mark Simmons. He shuffled through his papers, looking like he had been thrown into this case without preparation. His attempt at defending her was feeble, his voice barely rising above the murmurs in the courtroom. Your Honor, my client is deeply rooted in this community. She runs a children's center that serves over 200 families. She's not going anywhere. Judge Harrington's lips curled into what could only be described as a sinister smile. Mr. Simmons, your client is accused of falsifying documents to halt the lawful development of a multimillion-dollar property. These are serious charges. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. The project wasn't about progress, it was a land grab, an attempt to displace families for profit. But how could she prove it? How could she expose the truth in a courtroom where everyone seemed to have already made up their minds? The proceedings dragged on, each witness adding more layers to the fabricated case against her. As she sat there, alone in the defendant's chair, Emma's thoughts turned to Miguel. He had promised to be back in time to support her, but now, as the hours passed, she couldn't help but wonder if he would make it in time to save her from the injustice that threatened to destroy everything she had worked for. The courtroom felt suffocating as Emma sat in silence, waiting for the next phase of the trial. Her mind raced, but there was little comfort in trying to focus. Every word spoken by the prosecution felt like another strike against her. Jack Mitchell's voice echoed through her thoughts, his smooth delivery all too convincing to the jury, who seemed to be growing more convinced with every passing minute. The evidence he presented was damning, and her own lawyer, Mark Simmons, seemed utterly overwhelmed by the weight of the case. As the prosecution called their next witness, Emma could feel her pulse quicken. She had been through this so many times in the community, fighting to protect the center from outside threats, but this felt different. This was an entirely different kind of battle, and she had no control over the outcome. The witness called to the stand was Regina Hayes, the city's planning commissioner, whose testimony was meant to paint Emma as nothing more than a troublemaker. Regina took the stand with a practiced air of confidence, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as if she were the one in charge. Her tailored suit, expensive and immaculately pressed, was a stark contrast to the worn-down community center Emma had fought to protect. "Ms. Roberts," Regina began, her voice smooth but dripping with disdain. "Repeatedly interfered with the legal processes surrounding the city's development plans. She submitted false claims regarding the community center's historical significance, fabricating documents and signatures." Emma's stomach churned at the words. These signatures had come from real residents, from families who had used the center for generations. But how could she prove that now? The evidence against her was mounting, and the jury's faces remained unreadable, some looked bored, others skeptical. She had expected a fight, but she hadn't anticipated this level of manipulation, this much power being used against her. Emma could feel her face flush with indignation as Regina continued to speak, her words cutting through the air like knives. Ms. Roberts had her supporters sign petitions under false pretenses, claiming that the community center was a landmark when it was not. These are not the actions of someone trying to protect her community, but of someone willing to do anything to block a legitimate development. Emma's grip on her worn leather journal tightened. She had always known the risks of standing up to powerful developers, but hearing these lies spun so easily in front of the jury made her stomach turn. She leaned toward Mark Simmons, her lawyer, and whispered urgently, "They're lying. The signatures are real. The people, those families, believe in what we're doing." Simmons nodded but said nothing. Emma could see the fear in his eyes. This case was far too big for him. The weight of the city's power, the looming specter of corruption, and the immense stakes had him frozen, unable to act decisively. The cross-examination began, but Emma could already tell it was going to be a failure. Mark's questions lacked the sharpness they needed to dismantle Regina's carefully constructed narrative. Each of Mark's attempts to poke holes in the testimony was met with a swift objection from Mitchell, which Judge Harrington sustained without hesitation. The prosecution was winning, and Emma felt it slipping away. The sense of hopelessness began to creep in, as though the very walls of the courtroom were closing in around her. During a brief recess, as Emma sat alone at the defense table, the whispers from the court reporters nearby caught her attention. "This is just a show," one of them murmured to the other. "Crawford's already decided. His brother-in-law's funding the development." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had suspected corruption, but hearing it confirmed felt like the last piece of the puzzle snapping into place. Judge Harrington was compromised. This trial wasn't about justice, it was about protecting his own interests. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked slowly, each second stretching out painfully. Emma's mind was racing, the weight of the charges against her feeling almost suffocating. Her lawyer, Mark Simmons, had become nothing more than a silent observer in her struggle. He had no answers, no strategy to turn the tide in her favor. The evidence was stacking up against her, and Judge Harrington's cold, unflinching gaze showed no sign of wavering. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was a battle she might lose. But as the trial wore on, a thought began to take root in her mind: there was someone who could still change everything. Miguel. Ethan Roberts. Her husband. A Supreme Court justice. She had sent him a text during the recess, her heart in her throat as she typed the words, "It's worse than we thought. The judge is compromised. I need you here." She had no idea if he'd get the message, or if he could even make it in time. But she had to try. Miguel had promised to be back, but his emergency session in Washington had stretched longer than expected. Every minute without him felt like a dagger to her resolve. The developers were winning, and the city's powerful figures were lining up to crush her and everything she stood for. She glanced at the jury, their expressions unreadable. Some seemed indifferent, others plainly skeptical, but none seemed to believe her. How could they? The charges against her were backed by so many documents, so many experts. She was just one woman fighting for a community against a well-oiled machine. As the trial continued, the air in the courtroom thickened with tension. Emma couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a much larger game, one where the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The prosecution's case was nearly flawless, each witness and piece of evidence carefully curated to paint her as a villain. Every objection from Mark Simmons was met with swift overrule from Judge Harrington. He seemed to be in lockstep with the prosecution, his bias glaringly obvious to Emma now. She sat rigidly in her chair, trying to block out the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere. Her thoughts were consumed by Miguel. If only he were here, he would know what to do. He had always been the calm, steady one, the one who could cut through the noise and find the truth. He had taught her so much about the law, about justice, and now, more than ever, she needed that wisdom. If he could just step into that courtroom, if he could just walk in and show them what real justice looked like, everything would change. Minutes felt like hours as the proceedings dragged on. Emma's hope was beginning to fade when, suddenly, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Time seemed to freeze. Her breath caught in her throat as a figure entered, Miguel. He moved with purpose, his sharp suit and the authoritative air he carried making him stand out in the otherwise tense room. Emma's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just any husband rushing in to support his wife, he was a Supreme Court justice. And that single realization changed everything. Miguel's entrance had shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom entirely. Emma watched as he moved confidently toward the judge's bench, his presence almost magnetic. The murmurs from the spectators grew louder, whispers of recognition swirling through the room. Judge Harrington's face drained of color the moment he locked eyes with Miguel. The tension was palpable as the two men stood in stark contrast, Miguel, calm and composed, against the backdrop of a courtroom now suddenly on edge. "Proceedings will continue," Judge Harrington muttered, his voice betraying a hint of unease. His gavel struck, but it lacked the usual authority, almost as if it were a hollow gesture to maintain control. Miguel didn't seem to notice. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with calculated precision. He turned toward the prosecution, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Your Honor," Miguel began, his tone steady, but commanding, "I request permission to approach the bench." The courtroom fell into an expectant silence, all eyes now on the judge and Miguel. Harrington, still visibly shaken, nodded stiffly, trying to regain his composure. "This is unexpected," he muttered, acknowledging Miguel's presence. "We're in the middle of proceedings." Miguel didn't miss a beat. "Indeed we are, Judge Harrington," he replied coolly, using the judge's first name with deliberate familiarity. "But I am here to address a matter of great urgency. The proceedings involving my wife." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Relief flooded her as she met his steady gaze. This was it. This was the moment she had hoped for. The moment when the balance of power in that room would finally shift. The room was silent as the weight of Miguel's words settled over everyone. It was as though the very air in the courtroom had thickened, charged with the tension of the moment. Judge Harrington's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. The crowd, too, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Miguel stepped forward, his presence undeniable. "I have reason to believe that this trial has been compromised," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "I am here to ensure that true justice is served." Harrington's eyes flicked nervously to the jury, then to the defense table where Emma sat, still processing the shock of Miguel's arrival. She had been drowning, her fate seemingly sealed by a corrupt system, but now, with him standing there, something had shifted. The air of inevitability was no longer suffocating her, it was giving way to something else. Hope. Judge Harrington took a moment before responding, his voice tight with discomfort. "Mr. Roberts, while your presence is unexpected, we are in the middle of a trial. I cannot allow this disruption to continue." But his tone lacked conviction. There was fear beneath his veneer of control. Miguel didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Judge, I'm not here to disrupt the trial, I'm here to correct its course." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it deliberately on the table. "In this folder, you'll find authenticated documents proving my wife's innocence. You'll also find evidence of financial connections between Meridian Development and your own family." He let the weight of those words hang in the air. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harrington stiffened, but Miguel didn't give him a chance to respond. "I suggest you reconsider your position, Judge. These documents will be presented to the Chief Justice tomorrow if necessary." The tension was unbearable as all eyes shifted to Harrington. His face had gone pale, his usual confidence slipping away like sand through fingers. He opened his mouth but closed it quickly, clearly unsure of how to proceed. District Attorney Jack Mitchell stood up abruptly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We request a recess to consult." Miguel met Mitchell's gaze with a cold, calculating stare. "Of course. But let me remind you, Mr. Mitchell, that your office has been sitting on exculpatory evidence for weeks. Evidence that would have cleared my wife's name long before now." Mitchell faltered, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of Miguel's unrelenting presence. It was clear that the prosecution, once so confident, was now scrambling to hold on to its narrative. Judge Harrington, visibly rattled, raised his gavel. "The court will take a recess." But there was no authority in his command. 15 minutes, he added, his voice weak. "Court is in recess." As the room began to stir with quiet conversations, Miguel turned to Emma, his expression softening. He walked toward her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. He leaned down, whispering softly, "We're not done yet. This is just the beginning." And in that moment, Emma knew this was their fight now. The battle had just shifted, and it was no longer just her alone against the world. The recess gave the courtroom a momentary lull, but it felt more like a ticking time bomb. Emma sat at the defense table, her hands clenched tightly around her journal. She had been holding it for hours, as if its worn leather could somehow provide her the strength she needed. The minutes stretched on as the murmur of conversations filled the room. Even with Miguel by her side, the uncertainty loomed. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that, despite everything, the battle wasn't won yet. The forces aligned against her were powerful, and the corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. Miguel sat next to her, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an intensity that matched the weight of the moment. His eyes scanned the courtroom, noting every small movement, every shift in energy. The documents he'd brought, authenticated evidence, the financial links, and the affidavit from the residents, had been a critical blow to the prosecution's case. But the real test was yet to come. She had seen how far some would go to protect their interests, and even with the truth on their side, she feared they might find a way to twist it. "I'm not going to let them get away with this, Emma," Miguel said quietly, his voice filled with quiet determination. His gaze softened when it met hers. "We'll win this. But it's going to take everything we've got." Emma nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew he was right. They couldn't let the system swallow her whole. But the stakes had never been higher. The eyes of the city were on them, and the political power behind the developers was vast. As the recess drew to a close, the tension in the room was palpable. Emma felt her heart race as the bailiff returned to the front of the courtroom, signaling the end of the break. The crowd's murmur quieted, and everyone took their seats, as if the stillness itself was preparing for the next phase of the battle. Miguel stood, adjusting his suit jacket with a confidence that seemed almost palpable. His every movement was deliberate, controlled, calm in the face of the storm. Emma couldn't help but watch him in awe. She had always known him as a brilliant, capable man, but seeing him in action now, facing down the corruption that had wrapped its fingers around her life, was a side of him she'd never witnessed before. The power he wielded, the authority he commanded, wasn't just because of his position on the Supreme Court. It was because he believed in something greater, justice. The doors to the judge's chambers opened, and the two men, Miguel and Judge Harrington, exchanged brief, cold glances. The silence between them seemed to echo in the courtroom, a silent war of wills. Emma couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the subtle shift in the judge's posture. He had lost some of his earlier bravado, and for the first time, it seemed as though Miguel had the upper hand. As the judge's gavel struck once more, the room fell into silence, awaiting his verdict. The moment had arrived. The balance of power had shifted, but what would the consequences be? Emma could hardly breathe as she waited for what would happen next, knowing that, regardless of the outcome, things would never be the same again. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma sat on the edge of her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. Miguel had just returned from the judge's chambers, his expression unreadable. The few minutes he had spent with Judge Harrington behind those closed doors felt like an eternity. Emma could only imagine what had transpired in that private conversation. Had Miguel forced the judge to back down? Had he revealed the corruption that Emma had suspected for so long? The moment Miguel entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Gone was the calculated calm of the judge, replaced with a palpable unease that settled over the room. Emma could see the nervous glances exchanged between the prosecution and the judge, the subtle shift in their confidence as if the ground beneath them had suddenly begun to tremble. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, finally bringing the room back to order. "We will proceed," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. His gavel struck with less conviction, and the murmur of uncertainty in the gallery was enough to tell Emma that things were no longer the same. The balance of power had shifted, but how far would it go? Miguel took his place beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, but whether they would crush the corruption or be corrupted by it remained to be seen. The tension continued to build as the judge's gavel came down again, signaling the resumption of the trial. Emma could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders, as if the entire courthouse was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. She glanced at Miguel, who had not said a word since his return from the judge's chambers. His face was still calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, always 3 steps ahead. He had a plan, she could sense it, but what that plan entailed, she wasn't sure. "Ms. Roberts," Judge Harrington began, his voice more tentative than before, "we will continue with the proceedings. However, I must ask if there are any motions from the defense." Miguel stood, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Your Honor, we request the immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." His voice was firm, yet there was an undeniable undercurrent of authority that made it clear this wasn't just a request, it was a demand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Emma could feel the weight of the moment, as if the world was about to shift. The prosecution, once so confident, now shifted in their seats. Jack Mitchell stood, his face a mask of frustration. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he protested. "We are in the midst of an ongoing trial. These charges are serious." Miguel's gaze locked onto Mitchell, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to freeze. "The charges are built on a house of lies, Mr. Mitchell. The evidence that you have chosen to hide, the documents you've suppressed, this trial is nothing more than a farce." The room was silent as Miguel's words landed, the full weight of his accusation hanging in the air. Emma's heart raced. This was it, the moment where the truth would either be fully revealed or swallowed by the corruption that had tainted everything. The courtroom had never felt more like a battlefield. The air was thick with tension as Miguel stood at the center, his commanding presence overshadowing the mounting chaos. Emma sat beside him, her heart pounding in her chest as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Miguel had just demanded the dismissal of all charges, but the prosecution wasn't backing down. Jack Mitchell, though visibly rattled, was trying to maintain his composure, his fingers tapping nervously against the wooden bench as he glanced toward Judge Harrington. "Your Honor, this is absurd," Mitchell began, his voice rising. "This trial is not some circus where we throw out the evidence on a whim. Ms. Roberts is guilty, and the law is clear. We have proven the falsification of documents." Miguel cut him off, his voice cold and unwavering. "You have attempted to prove it, Mr. Mitchell. But the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how much you try to bury it. The evidence I've presented today, the financial connections, the false signatures, you cannot ignore them. This is not justice, this is manipulation." The courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Harrington, who had been uncomfortably silent, looked between the two men, his usual stern expression cracking with doubt. For the first time, it seemed like the judge wasn't just an impartial figure in this fight, he was beginning to feel the weight of the corruption he had been complicit in. Mitchell, seeing his grip slipping, turned toward the jury, his voice faltering. "The defense would have you believe this is all part of a grand conspiracy, but the facts are clear, Your Honor. We have proof." Miguel stepped forward again, his gaze locked onto the prosecutor with unrelenting intensity. "The truth will speak for itself, Mr. Mitchell. And when it does, you'll have a lot more to explain than I think you're prepared for." The room fell into a tense silence, as if the entire courtroom was collectively holding its breath. Emma could feel the weight of Miguel's words hanging in the air. The power had shifted, but she wasn't sure how far that shift would carry them. She watched as Judge Harrington, once so confident in his position, hesitated. His eyes flicked from the defense table to the prosecution, then to the jury, as though searching for an escape from the trap he was now caught in. Miguel's steady gaze never left Mitchell, who seemed to be unraveling in real time. The prosecutor's once firm posture now faltered, his hands clenched at his sides, the facade of control slipping. Emma could see the desperation in Mitchell's eyes, the knowledge that his carefully constructed case was starting to crumble under the weight of Miguel's truth. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear that neither the judge nor the prosecution knew how to react to this new reality. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, trying to regain some authority. "I will take a moment to deliberate," he muttered, and with that, he retreated to his chambers, the door closing behind him with a definitive thud. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the spectators' shock palpable. Emma's hands were shaking as she turned to Miguel, her heart racing. He caught her gaze, offering a reassuring smile, though she could see the tension in his eyes. "This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I know this feels uncertain," Miguel said quietly, leaning in. "But we've made our case. The truth is out. Whatever happens next, we've done what we set out to do." Emma nodded, trying to steady her breath. The wait now felt like an eternity, each passing minute stretching her nerves to the breaking point. They had come this far, but she knew the final decision would determine everything, their future, her freedom, and the fate of the community center. The courtroom was eerily quiet as everyone awaited Judge Harrington's return. Emma could feel the tension thick in the air, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She looked at Miguel, who remained calm beside her, his posture unwavering despite the gravity of the situation. They had made their case. The evidence was clear. But would the judge be willing to go against the powerful forces that had once held him in place? Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Emma's anxiety grew, the silence of the room amplifying her thoughts. She could hear the soft murmurs of the gallery behind her, the whispers of the people who had witnessed the courtroom drama unfold. Some were hopeful, others were skeptical, but all were waiting for the final decision. Finally, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and Judge Harrington emerged, his face drawn and pale. He looked less like the powerful figure who had presided over the trial for days, and more like a man who had just been confronted with something he couldn't ignore. The weight of his decision was now visible on his face. The room fell silent once again as Harrington made his way back to the bench. He took a long moment to sit down, his gavel resting idly in front of him as he stared at the documents in front of him. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that everything hung on what he would say next. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence in the courtroom. He finally lifted his gavel, its sound cutting through the stillness like a crack of thunder. After careful consideration, he began, his voice tight. I find that there has been a significant amount of misconduct throughout these proceedings. Emma's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought her heart had stopped. The words felt like a lifeline thrown to her in the midst of an ocean of uncertainty. She turned to Miguel, who gave her a subtle nod, his eyes never leaving the judge. Harrington continued, his voice wavering slightly. However, due to the serious nature of the charges and the overwhelming evidence presented by the defense, I have no choice but to recuse myself from this case. The shock in the courtroom was palpable. The whispers rose again, louder this time, as everyone processed what had just been said. Judge Harrington, who had been the very embodiment of the legal system's authority, was stepping down. Mitchell stood, his face pale with disbelief. Your Honor, you can't be serious. You're abandoning the case? The evidence against Ms. Roberts is indisputable. But Miguel was quick to respond, his voice steady, his every word deliberate. The truth is indisputable, Mr. Mitchell. And it will be made clear to everyone involved, including you. Judge Harrington's hand trembled as he motioned for the bailiff to take over. This court will be adjourned. A new judge will be assigned to continue the case. As the gavel came down again, Emma allowed herself a moment of hope. It wasn't over yet, but this was the first real victory she'd felt in days. They had taken a step forward, finally. The news of Judge Harrington's recusal sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom, but Emma couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The fight was far from over. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They would fight to keep the case alive, and if a new judge was brought in, they would have another opportunity to twist the facts and continue the smear campaign against her. But for now, the judge had spoken, and the victory felt real. At least for a moment, the scales of justice had tilted in her favor. Miguel remained calm, his face an unreadable mask as he exchanged a quiet word with Mark Simmons. Emma barely heard them, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. They'd won this small battle, but the war was still being waged. Her thoughts were interrupted by the rustling of papers and the shuffle of footsteps. The bailiff stepped forward, his face grim as he addressed the room. The court will be adjourned for the day. The case will be reassigned to Judge Helen Carter. Emma's stomach twisted at the mention of the new judge. She had heard of Judge Carter. She was known for being fair, but also tough. She could be an ally, or she could make things even harder. Miguel's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she could see the uncertainty in his expression. The new judge could change everything. Let's take it one step at a time, Miguel said softly, as if reading her mind. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. Emma nodded, though she knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle would come in the next trial phase, with a new judge, new challenges, and new risks. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything she'd fought for. The days following Judge Harrington's recusal were filled with tension and anticipation. Emma barely slept, her mind constantly turning over the details of the case. Every conversation, every decision felt like it carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Miguel was as focused as ever, but even he couldn't deny the uncertainty that hung in the air. The next trial phase was crucial. Judge Carter would decide whether to dismiss the charges completely or allow the case to proceed. In the meantime, the prosecution wasn't giving up. Jack Mitchell, though temporarily silenced by the judge's recusal, was already planning his next move. Emma could sense it. The legal system was full of obstacles, and those who played the game with the most power rarely lost without a fight. Miguel worked tirelessly to prepare for the new trial, digging deeper into the financial ties between the developers and the powerful political figures who had been pulling the strings. He knew that this wasn't just about saving Emma's community center, it was about dismantling a system of corruption that reached much further than he had ever anticipated. Every new revelation felt like a victory, but he also knew that the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the fight became. One evening, as they sat together in their small office, papers scattered around them, Emma turned to Miguel, her eyes weary but determined. "Do you think we can win this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel paused for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and resolve. "We're going to make sure the truth comes out, Emma. And in the end, the truth will always prevail. But we need to be ready for whatever comes next." The words didn't bring instant comfort, but they strengthened her resolve. She had never backed down before, and she wasn't about to start now. With Miguel by her side and the truth in their hands, they were ready for whatever the next battle would bring. The courtroom was once again filled with tension as the new trial date arrived. Emma could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she sat beside Miguel. Today would determine if they could finally move past the hurdles that had been thrown at them, or if they would once again find themselves fighting an uphill battle. The whispers in the gallery had grown quieter now, as if everyone was aware of the magnitude of the stakes. Emma was no longer just a woman fighting for her community center, she was now a symbol of something much larger, a fight against a corrupt system that threatened everything she believed in. Judge Helen Carter entered the courtroom with a level of authority that commanded instant respect. She was known for being fair, but also for having a no-nonsense attitude. Emma felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. Judge Carter might be impartial, but the battle was far from over. As the judge took her seat, Miguel stood to address the court, his voice steady, his words measured. "Your Honor, we are here today to ask for the dismissal of all charges against my client. The evidence against her is not only insufficient, it is built on false pretenses." Emma could see the effect of his words, the way the jury was already shifting their attention to him. Miguel had always been a master of making the truth resonate. He wasn't just presenting facts, he was presenting the truth in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She could only hope that Judge Carter, with her reputation for fairness, would see through the layers of manipulation and corruption that had been forced upon them. Judge Carter listened intently, her sharp eyes fixed on Miguel as he spoke. Emma could feel the shift in the room, the calm before the storm. She had spent so many days in this courtroom, battling against the tide of false accusations and corrupt tactics, but now, with Judge Carter presiding, there was a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The prosecutor, once so confident, shifted in his seat, his earlier bravado fading. Jack Mitchell was struggling to regain his footing. His case, built on deceit and fabricated evidence, was unraveling in real time. Emma watched as Mitchell stood up, his expression tight with frustration. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "the defense may claim that these documents are false, but we have evidence from reputable experts who have analyzed them. We have witnesses, we have testimony. To dismiss these charges would undermine the integrity of the justice system." Miguel didn't flinch, his calm demeanor never wavering. "The only thing undermining the integrity of this court, Mr. Mitchell, is the evidence you chose to suppress," Miguel countered. And those so-called experts? They were paid to give the answers you wanted, not the truth. You cannot hide behind manufactured lies any longer. The tension was electric. Emma could feel the weight of every word spoken, the gravity of each moment pushing her closer to the edge. Judge Carter had yet to respond, but Emma could see the subtle shift in her expression, the way she was considering everything carefully, weighing the truth against the web of lies that had been spun around them. Miguel had always said that the truth would win in the end, but Emma knew better than to believe that was all it would take. They were up against a system designed to protect its own, and every victory they gained felt like a fleeting moment before the next challenge would arise. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy energy as the trial continued, but today felt different. Emma could feel it in the air, the balance of power had shifted, and the tide was turning in their favor. Judge Carter's demeanor remained calm and measured, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of tension as she prepared to make her decision. The trial was at a critical juncture, and everything they had worked for hung in the balance. Miguel stood before the judge, his voice firm and clear as he presented the final pieces of evidence. Your Honor, the truth is irrefutable. The evidence we have provided proves that these charges are based on manipulation, not fact. We ask that the charges be dropped in their entirety, as they have no legal basis. Emma's heart raced as she listened to Miguel's words. She had fought for so long, against such powerful forces, and it felt like the culmination of all her struggles was finally within reach. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of uncertainty and focus. She knew they were listening intently, trying to piece together everything they had heard. For the first time, she felt that she might actually win, against all odds. But even as hope flickered in her chest, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. The prosecution had been relentless, and Emma knew that despite the mounting evidence, Mitchell wouldn't back down without a fight. She held her breath as Judge Carter leaned forward, her gaze flicking between the defense and the prosecution, preparing to give her ruling. Judge Carter's gavel echoed through the courtroom, silencing the murmurs of the spectators. The moment had come. Emma's pulse quickened as she watched the judge, the weight of her decision now pressing down on them all. The next few minutes would determine everything, her future, her freedom, and the fate of the community center she had fought so hard to protect. After careful review of the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides, Judge Carter began, her voice steady but resolute. It is clear that there have been substantial missteps in this case. The evidence brought forth by the defense demonstrates that the charges against Ms. Roberts were based on falsified documents and a clear attempt to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. Emma felt a flood of relief wash over her, but she kept her focus on the judge, waiting for the final decision. Mitchell stood, his face twisted in frustration. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the judge silenced him with a single, sharp gesture. I will not allow this court to be used for personal or political agendas, Judge Carter continued, her gaze unwavering. Therefore, I hereby dismiss all charges against Ms. Roberts, with prejudice. The case is closed. The words hung in the air for a long moment, the gravity of the ruling sinking in. Emma could hardly believe it. After everything, it was over. The charges were dropped, and the fight she had waged against the corrupt forces threatening her community had ended in a victory. She turned to Miguel, her heart full, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Miguel met her gaze, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. You did it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the last few days lift from her shoulders. They had won. But even as she felt the triumph, she knew this victory was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, still more battles to fight, but for now, she could finally breathe. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Emma stood there, her hand still resting in Miguel's, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying slowly begin to lift. The case was officially closed, the charges dismissed, and the corrupt system that had tried to tear her world apart was now exposed for what it truly was. As the evening light bathed the city in golden hues, Emma found herself looking at the world through new eyes, eyes that had seen the worst of human nature but had also witnessed its capacity for change. The victory was sweet, but it was bittersweet too. She could feel it in her chest, the mix of relief and sorrow. She had fought for so long, poured so much of herself into protecting the community center, the children, and the families that depended on it. The battle had taken a toll, not just on her body, but on her spirit. But now, with the truth finally out, the weight of injustice had been lifted, and she could look forward to rebuilding, to moving forward with the knowledge that they had done the right thing. Miguel squeezed her hand gently as they walked down the steps, the evening air cool against their skin. "We've come a long way," he said quietly, his voice filled with both pride and tenderness. "You were incredible, Emma. You've always known how to fight for what matters." She smiled at him, feeling a warmth spread through her. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I couldn't have done it without us." They paused at the bottom of the steps, looking out over the city. It had been a long, exhausting journey, but now there was a sense of peace between them. They had been through so much together, trials, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but they had emerged stronger. And Emma knew that whatever the future held, she and Miguel would face it together, as a team. As they walked side by side, Emma felt the weight of the past few months slowly fade. The feeling of being trapped in a fight that seemed endless was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild what had been threatened. The community center, the heart of so many families, was safe. But beyond that, the victory was about more than just one building. It was about reclaiming a sense of justice in a system that had so often seemed broken. Miguel had been her rock throughout it all, his presence unwavering, his belief in her never faltering. But it wasn't just about the case. It was about the years of work they had put into their shared dreams. She had been so consumed by the fight that she hadn't fully realized just how far they had come together. Now, standing at the edge of a new chapter, Emma understood that the battle had forged something stronger between them. They had always fought for the same things, but in the quiet moments, they had built something deeper: trust, love, and a shared commitment to a future built on justice and truth. As they reached their car, Miguel turned to her with a soft smile. "So, what's next?" he asked, his voice light but filled with meaning. The question hung between them, as much about the case as it was about their lives beyond the courtroom. Emma paused, looking at him, a feeling of peace settling in her chest. I think we start by going home. To the center. To the kids." She smiled, the tension that had built up over months finally melting away. "And then, we see where life takes us next." Miguel nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a shared understanding. "We'll face it all together. Just like we always have." As they drove away from the courthouse, the city lights glittering in the distance, Emma felt a quiet, profound sense of resolution. The fight had been long, and the scars would remain, but the victory was theirs, solid, unshakable. And it was only the beginning. With Miguel by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. Because the real victory wasn't just in the case, it was in the life they had built and the future they would continue to create, together.